The following video was sponsored by the Greek American Heritage Society of Philadelphia, preserving and promoting our community's history.
Our guest today has been a member of the Greek American community of Philadelphia for more than half a century now. Born and raised in New York and serving as an altar boy Archbishop Athenogoras, he is a true member and part of the fabric and history of our community today. Welcome, Father Demetrios Katerlis.
Ευχαριστώ, παιδί μου.
Father, tell us a little bit about being an altar boy and how you first came to know that you wanted to enter the priesthood.
Of course, I was baptized back in 1931 by Aimnisto Father Methodios Kourkoulis, who was the proistamenos of the cathedral back then. And I served in the altar, of course, as I was growing up until I finished high school. And all that time, I was with Archbishop Athenogoras, who was the ideal for me. You know, he stood some 6'4" besides the Kalimafi. And he personified what a Greek Orthodox bishop should be, and always has been for me. And, well, growing up in New York, we grew up in a very strong, ethnically Greek community. Back then, everything was in Greek, of course, in the churches. I remember when I became and I always wanted to become a priest. In my grammar school autograph book, what do you want to be? A priest from grammar school. Because my grandmother, Zoe, was cousin to Archbishop Chrysostomos of the Church of Smyrna, whom the Turks, Oxopodo, murdered in 1922. So I grew up in a very strong ethnic Greek Orthodox family. I never wanted to be anything but a priest. And Athenogoras accepted me into the seminary. I still have letters of his accepting me as a student. And there is so much in my mind now. Don't forget, this past July was my 85th birthday, which means truly I am living my 86th year. So, and I thank God because we're sitting here in this beautiful church. It was called in the 19th century the most beautiful Greek revival building in America.
We're talking about St. George Cathedral.
We're sitting here. My whole life is here in St. George.
Well, let's backtrack just for a brief second and talk about the seminary in Brookline, Massachusetts for a moment.
At the seminary, we were blessed to have a very holy scholarchi, or dean of the seminary, Father Ezekiel Tsoukalas, who later became Archbishop in Australia and then Archbishop of Kos Ketalipa, a very saintly man. I remember back then at the seminary, the going rate for the professors was $168 a month. They all lived on campus, ate at the seminary dining area with us, one great family, students and faculty, and the bishop, everyone together as one family. That's the church in which I grew up back then. And I remember when I was his ipotaktiko. I was his assistant as a student. I used to make his Greek coffee every day.
Well, these were impressionable years for you, would you say?
Of course.
And were there some people or some individuals?
Don't forget, I was in my 17th year. Right. So, of course, it did impress. And he would, at the end of the month, the checks were given out. He would take his check, sign it over to the seminary. He wouldn't accept his pay. And he would say, Dimitri, εδώ ζω, εδώ υπάρχω, εδώ τρώγω, εδώ πίνω. He was a real, honest Greek Orthodox bishop in his heart. He served Christ, not his pocket. And having him as an example, having back home later Father Vasilios Efthimiou at the Cathedral, and Father George Papadeas, his assistant. These were holy people who lived the Orthodox faith.
These were also, would you say, mentors that shaped your future?
Of course, very strong. They didn't work for pay. They worked for Christ. These are the things with which I was imbued. And I thank the Lord. I commemorate them at every single service. I commemorate them all, because how could I forget those who were so responsible for me? Together with my parents and Yaya, I didn't recognize, I never met any of my papudas, but Yaya.
Well, tell us a little bit about post-cemetery life for you. What followed?
After seminary, I went back home to New York. I went to the Episcopal Seminary a few blocks away from my home, because I was born and raised 25th Street between 2nd and 3rd, East Side, New York. And over in Chelsea section at 22nd Street is the Episcopal Seminary, General Theological Seminary, the first Episcopal Seminary in America. So,
well, what took you there?
Well, I wanted to continue studies, and also I wanted to be a married priest. But to be a married priest, you have to marry before ordination. Right. Once you're ordained a celibate, paiteliose. So, and I was young at the time, of course. And I went there. I got my Master's of Sacred Theology. And then Archbishop Michael, the holiest man who ever rose to Archbishop of America. From Corinth, he came to America as our Archbishop. A holy man. He got me and he said, Dimitri, εσύ πιάνεις από γράμματα. You're academically good. And he got me a Taylor Scholarship to go for graduate studies to the University of Athens.
How old were you at the time?
25 or so. Well, of course, yes. Of course. That was in 56. So, when I got there, I was pleased. It was the first time I had ever stepped foot in Greece. After I was born and raised here. And during the Depression, we didn't go on travels abroad to Greece. You know, going across with the Staten Island ferry to Staten Island, that was a trip for us back then. It was a nickel a ride. The reality of life in America. You see, in Greek, this is the reality of our life in America at the time. during the Depression. And we grew up in an America that was truly conservative Christian America. God bless Roosevelt. I'm living on Social Security now, my only source of income. And he would say, America is a Christian nation. Of course, now it's no longer politically correct. Alofto. And our country was 130 million people. That was America. And we New Yorkers always thought of New York and everything west of the Hudson River as the rest of America.
You also mentioned to me previously that New York shaped a lot of who you are today. You distinguish yourself by using lots of different languages.
As a New Yorker, East Side New York, we were from all parts of the world. That's why we're real Americans. All Americans are immigrants. When I was growing up, this was so obvious. The area at the time was heavily Greek and Armenian. A lot of Armenians, they had their Armenian churches, the Cathedral on 35th Street, on 27th, a parish, etc. And if someone walked down the street speaking without an accent, heads would turn and say, what's this foreigner doing here? They expect you to speak English with an accent. That's the America I grew up in. All East Side New Yorkers are slightly kosher. We use Yiddish interchange. We don't even realize it. It's part of our milieu as New Yorkers to use these different languages. And unfortunately, now as a priest I say unfortunately, all of us playing, all the boys playing after school. And by the way, we didn't have playgrounds. We played in the streets. But there weren't many cars back then. We didn't have to worry.
Let's briefly talk again about arriving in Greece at the age of 25, studying there, traveling around, how it shaped your life.
Well, it was a great experience, of course, because I was not in any way shocked by what I saw. I felt very much at home. Coming from my own New York background, I didn't come into Athens and feel shocked by the surroundings. God bless Gulandri, the ship owner back home in New York, who was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Cathedral. When he heard I got a scholarship to go to Athens, he asked, Dimitri, posa pascato? Back then, it wasn't air travel. It was the Frideriki, the Anna Maria, And I said, well, δέχεσαι να πας με ένα δικό μου? He had tankers. He had a 32,000 tanker, Andros Hills, brand new, and it was going to sail from Martin's Hook for Sicily. For Brindisi, if I remember correctly. And pragmati, I went free of charge in the Thesi of Antipopliarchou. I had my own cabin. And so I lived these 10, 11 days it took to cross over with the Greek seamen. And again, I felt at home. All the trip we were talking about where they were from in Greece, and when we got to Kerkyra, I got off and got on a Greek ship to take me to mainland Greece. And it was a wonderful thing. On that ship in Kerkyra, Prime Minister Karamanli got on board at the time. I still have pictures of him. I was in awe. The Prime Minister of Greece, And he spoke English, so and he said a few words, very kind, of course, to a student to talk to me. And that's where I got to Greece.
Well, tell us about your time frame there and traveling around.
And when I got to Piraeus, to Piraeus, the father of my sister's husband, my sister Olympia, married a boy from Greece who was a graduate of the University of the Polytechnio. His father was an architect, and he's the one that came down to Piraeus and got me and my baula. And in fact, on board, Greek customs came aboard and checked out everything. And we had 7 Greek seamen, officers, coming back to Greece. They had brought back all sorts of things from Japan, from everywhere. And they asked me, would you say those things are yours? And so, because they would have been taxed heavily. Being a good little Greek American, when they came on board, the Greek customs officials, I spoke only English. They would speak to me in Greek. I don't understand. That way they couldn't question me because I couldn't lie. So I just, yours, yes. And they got their things into Greece free of charge. God bless them.
Well, let's talk about your education there too, and maybe seeing the country.
And when I got to the university, there was the president of the university was called Bratsiotis, a great theologian, a great professor of Greece. And he looked at me. I had a master's of sacred theology from the Episcopal Church, and he looked at me and said, you realize we don't have above that at the University of Athens right now. Now I'm talking about, this is in 56. Things have changed wonderfully since then. And I said, well, what do your theologians do? Well, he says, they go to France, they go to Germany, they go. And I said, wait a minute. I go to France and Germany to study Orthodox theology? And he said, well, he says, that's it. I said, no. He said, well, look, it's my first time in Greece. I have a scholarship. I want to come and I want to travel around. And he figured out, do you accept if we put you in the 4th grade to take the extasis, the examinations for that group? And that way I was able to justify my scholarship at the university, because that was my only source of income, the scholarship. The Taylor Scholarship, God bless Taylor. He owned the St. Moritz Hotel back home in New York. He was from an island in the Sea of Propondis, from temporarily Turkish-occupied Asia Minor, and came, and as a real Greek, wound up from dishes owning the St. Moritz Hotel. Wow. The brilliant of the mind of the Greek. That's why I'm so proud of Hellenic culture. So I accepted, of course, and I was there for 2 years. And my first thing was to leave from Piraeus aboard a Turkish ship heading for Constantinople.
Was this your first initial trip?
The first time when I walked onto ancestral turf.
How did that feel?
It was wonderful. I got there. Now, on board, there were a number of Greeks going back to Constantinople. At that time, Constantinople was still flourishing with Greeks.
56, I think you said, right?
Yes.
1956.
And including an archbishop from Constantinople on board. I have pictures and notes and whatnot of all these things. And I went down, and the first night I spent in Chalkidona, which is on Asia Minor's shore, across from Constantinople on the European shore. So my first night was actually on ancestral land. And then I was taken and put up at the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. Of course, he was Archbishop Athinagoras at the time. He had become, and he was such a wonderful man. He allowed me to reminisce with him. Here he is, ecumenical patriarch of 350 million Orthodox Christians. And he would sit and talk about the old times with a New York student. I mean, that meant so much. As I said, these are the archbishops I grew up with.
Well, tell us a little bit about, since we were in that area, let's talk about your family's ancestry from there.
Well,
tell us what the name of the town or the village or...
My father was born and raised in the Propondida. It's a sea between the Black Sea and the Aegean. It's between the Bosphorus and Çanakkale, that they call now. That sea, all the towns around that were 100% Greek. There were Turks in the area, but in my father's hometown, Triglia, during the 19th century, they had a Greek gymnasio or high school, 6-year high school, when so many parts of Greece in the 19th century didn't have high schools. Of course, at that time in the 19th century, the outlines of Greece were much closer to Athens than it is now, you know. So they were educated there, and the Turks living in the area all knew Greek, or else they couldn't work, because everything was owned by Greeks. So my father, his father produced silk. In that area, Purus's area, silk making was the mainstay, and olive trees. So my papu, Dimitri, Greek boy named after his papu, Dimitri, produced silk and had olive trees. And my father always described how they fed the silkworms with mulberry leaves, etc. See, I grew up knowing these things from home.
Did your parents tell you all this? Did you have it written?
My father, and the year I was born, well, my grandmother in 1922, well, no, in 1915, there was the first massacre of Greeks, 1915. And all the towns of the Propondida were thrown out away from the coast. The Turks said that they were supplying the British submarines, as if the ordinary people in the villages knew about submarines. But it was a justification to massacre Greeks. So the first massacre, Yaya and her family had to go inland and returned in 1918 when the Greek army came, and they were free until 1922 when the Western powers supplied everything to Apesias Mnimis Ataturk and helped defeat the Greek army they were betrayed by the Allies.
Well, your family, did they stay after 1922?
In 1922, they went to the free part of Greece. And they went to Athens, where there were many refugees or πρόσφυγες. And they lived there until my father invited his mother to come here to America. In the meantime, my father had married here in 1925, and he brought his brother, his younger brother, he brought his two sisters to America, and back then, being a Greek, he had to provide dowries for his two sisters, because they married two Greeks, they wanted dowries back then. So my father worked and made dowries for him, and brought his brother, set him up in a restaurant. The obligation of a Greek man back then.
Did they all marry Greeks, by the way?
No. His brother never got married. He was my nuno. I always commemorate him on the 13th of December here at St. George. Taiou Evstratiu is my baptismal day, and it's one of the personal days that I would have liturgia here, because we celebrate birthdays, but above all, we should celebrate when we became Christians.
Tell us about finding your home village, your ancestral village.
When I first went to Constantinople, ο Πατριάρχης ο Αθηναγόρας arranged, and I went from Constantinople to Triglia in the Propondida, to the village. He arranged how I could get there. When I first got there, it was my first time exposed to Turks, Oxapodo, and I was afraid to speak Greek, honestly. I mean, I know what my father had gone through, what all my ancestors had gone through. I know my yaya's cousin was murdered by the Archbishop, by the Turks in 22. So I just said English. But what happened was, God provides for me. There was a Turkish major, or over there they call Bimbashi, who had been educated in New Jersey by the American Army. It was part of the exchanges, who spoke basic English. So he sat with me, and we were sitting in the cafenio in my father's hometown, and he was translating for me. What was he translating? When the exchange of populations took place, it wasn't really an exchange of populations. The Turks, murdered the Greeks and exiled them. The Greeks sent the Turks back into Asia Minor. It wasn't really an exchange. It was a massacre and exile. And to my father's hometown, they sent the Turks from Crete. And they arrived, but they only spoke Greek. They only spoke Cretan Greek. And when I got there at night, we're sitting in the cafenio, and all of them were speaking Greek to each other, and I was making out, they say in Arabic, Habar yok. I don't know what's going on. And the major was translating, because he was born and raised in Triglia, and so his ancestors were from Crete, so he knew Cretan Greek.
How did that make you feel sitting there that moment? I mean, was it like...
Very careful. I didn't want it to slip out, that I understood what's going on. And he was translated into English, the Greek. I was delighted as I was getting away with it. I was afraid. I was afraid. I have no I'm not Kolokotroni, you know. I admit it. I'm just a New Yorker who's smart enough to duck when bullets are flying.
How long did you stay in that village? For a day or two? Or?
Well, it's a town. It's not a village. As I said, it had a flourishing high school when there were very few in all of Greece. So it's a seaport, you see. And I stayed there for a while. And gradually, and I left, of course, in a few days. It was a couple of weeks, etc. Then, the other times when I would go back, listening to them in Greek, I realized I don't have to be afraid of them. And the next time I went back, the people, one group was telling me, our daughter's getting married. And I figured, I said, well, where's the gambro from? Angira. And they turned to me in Greek. Turks, referring to the other Turks as varvari. No, he had to be a prosfigas. He had to be a refugee from Greece.
Did you befriend these people over time?
Now, because I go every year, now the royal carpet, and I've been there a number of times with Patriarch Bartholomeos Katerlis. Well, that's later history. Now, whenever I get there, they speak to me, of course. They speak to the Patriarch in Greek, and their children in their 50s and 60s learn some Greek still. Just like our children born and raised here know some Greek, and the next generations less, etc. It's the same with them. So I go, and they're always treating me as a brother.
Let's back up a little bit here. We went into a part of history which is extraordinary and part of your odyssey. But let's focus on your education in Greece, and let's wrap that up. What happened? You left the village, the town, and you came back.
And I went and I said, President Braciotti explained to me, I accepted with glee the opportunity to stay in Greece and ordered the lectures and whatnot. It was wonderful. But it was God's blessing, because I'm a New Yorker and my eyes weren't only on diplomas. I spotted this young Greek girl. No, this is the blessing of God. And I speak freely because I'm a New Yorker. I'm a human being. Her eyes attracted me. She was very young, and I went after her. Her parents, it was one daughter and one son, a younger son and the daughter. And the parents were against her coming to America. And they said, you have your prika, you have your dowry, why leave, why go to America? But her nuno, her godfather, was an officer in the Royal Navy and a staunch advocate of Eleftherios Venizelos, you know. And he spoke to them. And they sent him, how I met him, and her uncle, who had a big cafenio in Omonia, to meet me. They said, who's this American? You know, before I could meet the parents, who's this American? And the third degree. Later on, when I had daughters, I could understand what they did. Who are you? What are you doing? I told them. I'm going to become a priest. It's what I want. I'm going back to America. I'm not going to settle here. I'm going to bring my faith back to America. And he went back and told my in-laws, my future in-laws, if it's God's will, don't stand in your daughter's way. God bless Nuno Kostadino, the blessed name of our present king, Constantine the 13th.
So take us now forward. Did you actually marry in Greece?
And of course, well, you don't think they would allow her to leave the country with an American unmarried? We're talking about a real Greek Orthodox family.
Right. Okay.
A week we got engaged. We went out to Vula to a family land they had out there. Souvlaika, Arnya, I mean everything, Greek style.
Now, where was your family? They were all back in the States?
Oh, of course, everyone's. And we had the Aravona, and then they arranged the wedding at St. George Kypseli. The wedding on April 27th, in 1958.
But when you left for Greece in 56, was it? Or 58? Did you have any inkling that you were going to meet someone, or were you looking at the time?
I had assumed that. Well, I'd eventually marry back home in America.
But you went.
But when I saw her, that was it. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's God's plan. Right. He arranged, and she became the mother of my children, the grandmother, and the great-grandmother to my 3 great-grandchildren. She's the one that has supplied the family. The man's out working. It's the mother that does everything at home. So that's why I thank God. I mean, this is God's hand.
So tell us now, take us forward. What year, did you stay much longer? And did you immediately return to the States?
Oh, of course. Of course. I came back. In the meantime, I had written to Archbishop Michael that I'm coming back, and he arranged for me to come as an assistant to St. George. There was a priest called George Roussos from Andhra who was serving here, and I was to come as his assistant. And this was arranged before I came. It was Archbishop Michael. And the wonderful thing is that while I got married, of course, and I was put up by my in-laws, obviously I didn't have a home, but their home became my home. One night, I dreamt that I saw Archbishop Michael in all his finery of the Anastasi, because I used to serve him as his altar boy at the Cathedral back home in New York too, as an acolyte from the seminary. And I saw him, and I started crying in my dream now. And he took me into his arms, and he told me, "Migles, Dimitri, thamese mazi pali. We will be together again." And I woke up, and at breakfast, I told my in-laws and my new wife, yeah, I saw that dream. Later on in the day, we heard over the radio that day, Archbishop Michael was taken to heaven. He passed away. That's the souls of our people are with us all the time. Many times I've been visited by the souls. And here in Philadelphia, so many things have happened.
Well, what was your first impression when you arrived here?
Well, when I arrived, first, I was the first. But in the meantime, Father George Roussos was godson of one of the Gulandri rich families, the sea captains of them. And he was given the chance to go to St. Spiridon in Washington Heights, back home in New York, one of the biggest parishes in the country at the time. And of course the man went. So I never got to serve with him. He was here when I came, but then left.
How brief was your relationship? Days, months?
Oh, days.
So you arrived, and the next thing you know, you're thrown into the position.
Telling me about it. And the priest, because I was a deacon, and the priest assigned was a wonderful priest, Father Demetrios. He anglicized it to Davis, but it was Demetrios.
So tell me, what's your impression?
He actually, I was a deacon. He was a priest and remained priest. I came in on September 1st. I was ordained here March 15th, 1958, and he left in June because the board said, we want the young priest, American-born, to serve our parish.
So let's go back a little bit here and talk about that first impression. This was historically known as Greektown. This was right in the heart of a community. There was also another parish down the street, I think, still. Let's talk a little bit about what you saw in your first impression.
When I first came, don't forget, we Greeks love politics. My father was a follower of Eleftherios Venizelos, because he gave us Ελλάδα δύο υπήρων και 5 θαλασσών, Greater Greece. And at the time, the oldest Greek parish in the Philadelphia area was controlled by the royalists who liked the king. And that parish was formally established in 1906. 1901 they started, 1906 officially. And there, Zito o Vasiles. Now the Venizeliki, the people from the islands, from Asia Minor, from Macedonia, from Thraiki, from Epirus, most of them were Venizeliki. And so they got together and bought St. George. And St. George became the center of the Venizeliki.
What year was that? 22, I think? 22, yeah.
No, 1921.
Okay.
And I have, of course, for the archives, that's why I'm so careful where these archives are going to go. I want them preserved. Original manuscripts of the conveyance from the Episcopal Church to the Orthodox. All these original, because they were disregarded for many years. People didn't care about that. So this is available. Now, when I came, this was a very Greek immigrant parish. I was the first American-born priest to serve St. George. The first. My first daughter was born here, the first child of a priest born in St. George, and my second daughter was the second child born to a Greek Orthodox priest in St. George. And of course, they are part of the living history of St. George.
Did you live in the surrounding area?
We lived in the house above the building, the office building.
Store. Okay. You lived in this building?
Initially, we lived in an apartment across the street and then moved into the building here. So when I say St. George, my whole family is here. And back then when we said St. George, we meant the whole church congregation was one family. It wasn't the priest and the congregation. It was the priest and his family, the congregation. We were one. And there are families I have served for generations. When I first came, there were yayadas and papudas. I buried them, you know, and then their children. There were families that I served 5 generations of people here in Philadelphia, in St. George. So it was a really Greek immigrant. And I remember I always preached in both languages, Greek and English, because even in '58, we had children that were born here in America whose native language was Greek. And the mistake of many of the parents back then, I'm talking about '58 and earlier, they would scold their children. Δεν είστε Αμερικανοί, είστε Ελληνόπουλα. And I would say, don't say that. We are Americans of Hellenic cultural background. Don't say you're not Americans. Of course we're Americans. We're the best Americans, because look at what we offer to America. Our Hellenic culture, democracy, orthodoxy. And I got them to start to understand. Don't say you're not Americans. Gradually over the years, they began understanding that we are the best Americans. This is what we offer. Years later, when my first grandson, he was an altar boy, of course, from 5, 6 years old. When he was 12 years old or 13, I had translated the Gettysburg Address into Greek because I wanted to tie in my Greek people with the American way of life. Be proud of Greece, be proud of America. They're not against each other. I love my mother, America. I love my yaya, Greece. There's nothing, there's nothing contrary. And for the first time, I had my grandson read the Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863. I love history. And he read first the English original by Lincoln, and then the Greek translation. And when they heard of the people, by the people, for the people, and they would say, oh, that sounds like Greek democracy. I said, what do you think Lincoln was doing? The first real Republican president was democratic. Before, these party things, forget about parties. God bless America. We pray for our country, and God help us from our politicians. And I wanted our people to understand. And Thanksgiving Day, I instituted services on Thanksgiving Day. 7:30 in the morning, we would have liturgy, and I got permission. The whole liturgy was in English. And I explained to the people, in ημέρα των ευχαριστιών, μην ξεχάσει, θα φάμε τους Τούρκους.
What year was that you implemented?
In the 60s. From 60, 61, no.
Were there other?
Thanksgiving Day is not from the Orthodox calendar. It's not from Greece. Only America has, from the Pilgrims to Lincoln, celebrates Thanksgiving Day. It's a purely American. So I got permission from Yakovas, God bless him. And I would have the liturgy totally in English. Back then, no one had English. But I explained, Geronda. And he says, you're right. So we would have the liturgy in English and then walk over to Gimbel's, where Santa Claus would come, and the parade of Thanksgiving started the Christmas season. See, being a New Yorker, Macy's parade on Thanksgiving began the Thanksgiving, the Christmas season. I'm a New Yorker, so I brought that here too. But to tie in, not America as something different, but as the spiritual daughter of Hellenic civilization. You bless both. You thank mother and grandmother. And it worked over the years. And gradually, from a strictly Greek immigrant parish, it became a very strong Greek American parish. And this is the time of my being here. The future, they're becoming American parishes. More and more English. It's natural evolution. It's healthy. I preserved. That was mine. I am the bridge between the strictly immigrant to the strictly American. That's why when I first came here, all the archdiocesan material was in Greek, only Greek. So everything was in Greek. So I sat down, and that's why I brought some of these things. And I have so much to put on file. For instance, a brief historical survey of the origins of the Lenten services, including Great and Holy Week and Easter Sunday. You know, St. George Greek Orthodox Church.
That's done in English.
Totally in English. And notice, it was church. It was before we became a cathedral. Then, for instance, the Triodion, Part 1, a historical survey of the Lenten services and traditions. This is St. Photius publication number 44. This, a brief historical survey of Advent and Christmas services, fasts, and traditions, including the individual saints' feast days. St. Photius publication number 25. Now, this was all produced here at St. George. Back then, everything was paid for immediately. We never went into debt. Now they send out publications. We did it. And what did we have? Mimeographs, the hand-spun mimeograph. And I had young people type on membranes. The old mimeograph were membranes. And they would type. I never learned how to type right. And they would come, type right, and then we would put out in the office, page by page, the youngsters of our parish. The youngsters, for instance, one of these, with the justifiable pride of a father to his spiritual youngsters, many achievements on behalf of the church. The author dedicates this work to the Junior Goya of St. George, Philadelphia. The author also takes this opportunity to express his deep-felt thanks to his 4 summer secretaries. Their amazing ability to decipher his handwriting allowed them to produce the first typewritten manuscript of this work, while serving St. George as full-time voluntary secretaries for 6 full weeks. A debt of gratitude is also owed to the 3 young ladies who, after their regular employment, labored so diligently to produce the final stencils. Their names are Nina Argerakis, Franny Bouboulis, Marina Kalogris in English, Tina Karivalis, Elaine Androutsos, Mary Doukas, Xanthi Stathakopoulou. My paternal blessings will always be upon them and their parents. And I sign. You see, everything was produced here. The only cost was the paper. And I have lists of the St. Photius publications. There are dozens of them. I brought 3 of the oldest.
How long did you actually publish for in English like that?
Oh, they worked for a number of years until the Archdiocese started producing things in English.
So you sort of were a forefront or a leader in the idea?
American-born priests throughout the country were doing this.
It's not here.
I was the first American-born here.
Right.
But my fellow priests were doing this throughout the country. Our seminarians, American-born. See, half the seminarians when I was there at the seminary were from Greece. Their native language was Greek. The other half were American-born. So for us, we normally did this. It was natural to us. Throughout the country, this is not unique. But let me talk about my family here at St. George. Because I came with my wife. Our daughters were born here. But over the years, they brought to me my grandchildren and eventually my great-grandchildren. And think of it, my wife, Antonia Panayotou Tamvaiki, from Athens, Greece. I already spoke about her, the blessings of God upon me. In fact, I have a large icona of Saint Polycarpos, Episcopal Smyrnis, because on the 23rd of February was the day she accepted my proposal. And being a future priest, the way I could thank God was to make an icona of Ayu, and always I celebrated Ayus Polycarpos here. I'm a priest.
Talk a little bit more about the history of this church.
A visit of the late King George of Greece with its government in exile, 1942.
Right.
It was the clergy laity of the Archdiocese of America, and Archbishop Iakovos Athinagoras had decided it's going to be in Philadelphia. So they all came, and here in Philadelphia, the exiled king of Greece, exiled from the fascists and Nazis, he lived abroad. And when he came here, John Wanamaker produced a chair. In fact, we have it inside. I always used to have it outside on display. Now it's in the, I allowed no one to sit on it. Now it's being used, but John Wanamaker made an exact copy of the George Washington chair in Independence Hall that is called the George Washington chair, that he used as president when he presided. An exact replica was presented to St. George to be used as the temporary throne of the King of Greece. And underneath, it writes so. A gift from John Wanamaker in 1942. It said, that's why I always preserved it as a museum piece. But people aren't always interested in history. We have another, was a marble type topped table that was down in the basement, was the original communion table of the Episcopal Church right up here. And it was Egyptian marble. And I always preserved it. I covered it. And then one day, I don't know how, I find it in the hallway, that glass, that wooden, and I say, that is a museum piece. But people have to love history. This is part of St. George. And Another chair that was used for the officiating clergy is in the altar. When I came, I had found it down in the basement. And I had the velvet replaced and brought up. I had it brought up to date. Had used only by bishops, officials, etc. And unfortunately, they've taken that away, so they use it commonly. When I first came, loving history, I delved into the history of the parish. That was when I realized that the facade that the Greeks loved, it's obviously a Greek temple. But I found that it was copied from an ancient Greek temple in Teos of temporarily Turkish-occupied Asia Minor. So the fact that it was bought and named, it was St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. But the benefactor, the biggest amount given at the time of the purchase, was by a Greek from Thyatira. And his first name was George. And he was the greatest benefactor when they bought the church initially. He gave $5,000. 1921, that was a lot of money. And he said, no, he wanted to name St. George. And others said, well, no, that was egotistic. No, it was the hand of God. Because when this church was bought in 1921 and named St. George, Philadelphia, the year following, 1922, the original Cathedral Church of Philadelphia in temporarily Turkish-occupied Asia Minor, the people were massacred. And the church temporarily ceased, and we became the inheritors of the New Testament Church of Philadelphia. We are St. George of Philadelphia, the sixth church mentioned in the book of Revelation. St. George, and I've always emphasized this to our fellow Americans. Of course, your history starts here and here and here. The history of my church is in the New Testament. We're the only church that continues its history from the book of Revelation, from the New Testament. Who else has a claim like that? The Greek Orthodox Church, and they can't say no, it's in the Bible. You see, these are the arguments. You don't point out doctrinal differences and this and that. No, let's get back to basics where no one could argue. New Testament. So, over the years, this is what I've emphasized to our people. Look at what we have. Look at what we have.
Well, you've sort of answered the question I was going to say or ask, what makes this church so special?
Of course.
That's certainly probably the most significant.
There's so much we could talk about. The architecture, of course. There was a flat ceiling, a Greek-style temple ceiling. But in 1930, there was a Greek day school operating here, and there was the fire. And we lost the interior of the church. And the interior of the church back then was all white. When it's an Episcopal church, right here, of course there was no iconostasis. There was no altar screen. There were large ionic columns that went all the way to the top, and above the top, all in white, everything was white, was a great beam that read, "Holiness becometh thy house, O Lord," in English, of course. That was destroyed in the fire of 1930. That's when they put a temporary iconostasis. This iconostasis was completed in 1942 for the preparation of the clergy laity and the coming of the King of Greece, 1942. You see the history of our church.
Are there any other really distinguishable parts of history that we should mention out here?
Well, of course, as you could see to the left and right on the balcony, those are ancient urns for sacrifices, copies of ancient Greek urns. Everything was Greek at the time, you know, the concept in the church.
And down below, the architect.
I came, of course, I had to go below and see what, because I knew that this floor had been replaced up front and back because it had been burned out. And I went down below and I photographed part of the burned, it's still down there, rafters. And all I found was an earthen floor. There had been a wooden floor, but after the Greeks bought it, the church had been sold because the parish had moved away, etc. And the wooden floor had decayed, and all I found was dirt. And I know I read, because I became a member of the Pennsylvania Historic Society, and I went to their archives and found the history of St. George, when it was St. Andrews, and the books, the names of the first pastors, and how in 1821, in 1825 actually, they had a beautiful sermon on the cause of the Greeks, Kolokotoron's revolt against the Turks, that a pastor, Episcopal pastor, say we should help the Greeks in their revolt against the Muslims. They're Christians. And the initial help that came from America to the Greek Revolution, one of the places was St. George, St. Andrews in Philadelphia. Look at our history. You see God's hands. So later, in fact, when we used to participate in the Greek parade, the first float that I designed in St. George's float was the facade of St. George with an Episcopal minister, clergyman, giving a rifle to a Greek dressed as Kolokotroni, giving an arm, and to his right and left, two ladies in costumes of the time.
Did the parade ever cut through the front of the church? Did it?
No, I'm talking about New York.
Oh, up in New York, okay.
So, the original parade in Philadelphia originated when, from St. George, on March 25th, exactly on March 25th, Judge Lagakos was very involved in politics. He got 8th Street closed from this corner all the way to Chestnut. He got 8th Street closed to traffic, and St. George congregation would march out with their candles to Independence Hall, where the representative from Greece would commemorate Greek independence. We always had the ambassador come in from Washington also there. And we tied everything in from St. George. This is the origin of the parade that we still have here. But gradually we moved from the other parishes had to meet us down there, and they began complaining, justifiably so, that they shouldn't have to come to St. George to, and we agreed to go to the City Hall. And we would start from City Hall straight down Chestnut Street to Independence Hall. And we all would meet at City Hall. Then, gradually, the Federation. They do wonderful work. They do wonderful work. Gradually, they took over the parade. But the Federation did not start the parade. St. George Cathedral started it, and there are still many people who remember, not just this old priest who stands up for the truth. And I could say it publicly because no one could say it's not so.
There were 2 or 3 other important facts historically tied to this church. One deals with the architect. The other is the name, the cathedral name. Then we'll go on to something else, that a historic fire. Let's talk about those 2 first.
I mentioned 1930, the fire, and I went down below. I saw beams that are still down there, partially burned to them, and the floor here had to be replaced. And while down there, being a member of the Historic Society, I found that John Haviland, our wonderful architect, by request, asked to be buried at the cathedral. You see, this was the finest example of a Greek revival church in America. We have old newspaper articles, saying that, and he was proud of it. But I went down, all I saw was dirt. I figured it'd be somewhere in the center, and I started pushing the dirt around, and I found the outline in brick.
Of his burial site?
Yeah, and I looked, I said, so, this is probably where he was buried. But I know what I don't know. So I went to Independence Hall, and I asked one of the one of their archaeologists to come. And they verified that this was originally a burial place. And then I went to the archives, and I found out that John Haviland's body was disinterred at the Greek request. When they bought the church, all the area out here was a cemetery of wonderful old historic families of Philadelphia. But the Greeks said, and where the hall is, it was all cemetery. But the Greeks had said, at the time, we're not interested in history. And one of the prerequisites for purchase was a relocation of all bodies and graves. And they were taken to an Episcopal site, their old seminary.
Do we know what time frame that happened? Or?
Yeah, sure. When the church was purchased.
So in
1921, 22, of course. So they didn't realize that these wonderful historic sites, people would have come by and see, ooh, look at this family there. All right.
The markers were all removed, the bodies were all removed.
I don't blame them. I don't blame them. Go into the mind frame of an immigrant who hardly spoke English, let alone, they didn't appreciate ancient Greek history, let alone. So no, I don't blame them. They reacted very normally. And they were happy. They got rid of it. And where the hall is, they built a hall. I mean,
right. That was the cemetery, and that was removed, and the hall was built. And between the 2 buildings, is that where the other cemetery was? And that was paved over.
It became a garden initially. When I came, it was a garden still. Okay. Philoptoch was built much later, in the 70s.
And what happened to the architect that was downstairs?
Then I found out that his remains were taken to the Episcopal Seminary, and he was reinterred there.
What year was that approximately?
Probably must have been 1922 or so. And the stones are all out there. And of course, I've been there. I've offered prayer for him. After all, we pray for the President of the United States, who's not a Greek Orthodox. We always pray, no matter who he is. And of course, I offered a prayer for him as a child of God, right where he's buried now, reinterred.
And now let's talk about the name Cathedral, how this became the Cathedral Church.
Well, way back in the 30s, there was difficulty between the Royalists and the Venizelos. And because this was right in the center, they started using the term cathedral during the late 30s. And it wasn't.
Who was using the term? The church? Members?
Church officially. The people here. And there's, that's evangelism, we're a cathedral. We're Cathedricos now. They weren't really. When I first came, they referred us Cathedricos now. I kept quiet. I didn't know the history. Then I realized no one had declared it a cathedral from the Archdiocese. But I remember picking up in 71, Archbishop Yakov was coming over. And I told him, and he said, I found it that way. I wasn't going to. But we have all the letters standing on that throne right there, officially declaring St. George, the Cathedral of Greater Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley. Right there.
Interesting.
But during the fire, one thing that had occurred. When I went down, I found the icona of Panagia. So when I came, I found that icona and the icona of St. Nicholas in the back, downstairs in the basement.
They weren't up top here? They weren't?
Oh no, they were down there. And I said, it's beautiful. And they said, oh, that icona used to stand up here. The iconostasio that was then was a plainer one than this.
Right.
White. Was burned.
Completely.
And all the icons burned. Except that one icon stood up in the fire. And when they built this in 42, they took it and went downstairs.
Until it was replaced and brought back out?
And when I found it, I noticed that from one of the eyes, it was swollen. And it was liquid. And I'm looking at it. I said, wait a minute. I was a lot younger then, and I could see well. And there were people up here. I said, come on down. And we went, and the caretaker of the Neokoro looked, and then when he put his finger on it, and it broke, and tear came out. The painting had, and when I saw that, I said, Pedia, this icona has to come back up. Δάκρυσε η Παναγία. At that time, I brought it back up, second floor of the office building, and made a chapel in 1960 of Panagia Pandovasilissa, named after my father's hometown parish, Panagia Pandovasilissa, a 7th century Byzantine monastery. And we were up there. And I have pictures of their making the iconostasio. And I see there's so much to say. When the older people could not really climb up. But for the 15th of August, we would start services up there and continuous services all night long, Oloniktia, 7 sermons in between. And we have this all on tape. In fact, on tape, 1/16 of a second. The really slow tapes. And the first liturgy was early morning. The second liturgy was later on the 15th of August when all people would be able to come, etc. I mean, the history of this parish, the all-night services. But back then, this was Greek town. People walked to church, and the place was always crowded. We had upstairs, always there are people upstairs when I came, and got downstairs, and over 1,000 people can sit in this church. So that's the history of St. George, the continuous history. But then Archbishop Yakovos, much later, when he came to bless the founding of the second part of our old age home, he personally blessed this chapel. He did the blessing of the chapel, and he was so happy because it was named in Pando Vasilisa from Triglia, and being from that area, he was so happy. Kala, Pando Vasilisa.
There was another historic moment that took place for you, and in 1970, in this cathedral, you received the Royal Order of the Phoenix from the government of Greece. Well, tell me about that, because look, it says this honor is awarded to a world citizen that has raised Greece's international prestige.
A recognition from the King of Greece. It's a royal. I was granted the Golden Order of the Cross of Phoenix for my ethnic work in America. They were pleased, since an American-born priest was teaching them all about Greek history. And always, we had all the ethnic holidays. Ethnic holidays they had forgotten. We always had at St. George.
Has the priesthood taught you anything, or what has it given you overall in life? What has it done for you?
I've always wanted to become a priest, and I live my life. Morning, noon, and night, I'm a priest. There's no other side to me. I'm always a priest. That's why when I go on vacations to Greece, for instance, I take my presbytera, and we go to monasteries, we go pilgrimages. One of the things that we started in St. George, every year we would have 30, 40, 50 people from St. George on an annual pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. Because too many Americans think of Christmas, for instance, as Dickens' Christmas story, 19th century England. No. Christianity is from the Near East. Jesus was born and raised in the Jewish area. We Orthodox still serve. Protochronia, beginning of the year, is September for us, as it was for Jesus. Easter, we call Pascha, which is a corruption of the Jewish word Pesach, which means Passover. See, we're the original Christian church, founded by Christ. So all these things are part of our everyday life. Our wedding ceremony. I baptize children of fifth generation family that I've been serving. For weddings, however, we must realize, and I'm sorry that when they print up what happens during a Greek Orthodox ceremony, they come up with nicely printed stuff about the wedding, and they call it ceremony. It is a sacrament, one of the 7 sacraments of the church. It's not a ceremony. Το καταντήσανε ορισμένοι ceremony. It is a sacrament. And also, we Orthodox go back to our roots. When we do a sacrament, where do we get it from? Where do we get it from? From the holy apostles themselves. When the apostles became the first Christian bishops, they became the first church. What did they do to the wedding? They used the customs they knew. One of the Jewish customs, the Jews still do, the dancing around the canopy. We Orthodox, when we say Isaiah Choreve, it's not some sort of a dance of joy only. We got it from the original Hebrew, the dance, the rabbi and the couple. I mean, that's how far back we go. And in this explanation of the marriage ceremony, they forget that we're not chthesini. We are the original. The cup of wine. To this day, the Jewish people give a cup of wine. It's the cup of life together. Now they try to say, well, it's not really the communion. Of course it's not communion. The apostles introduced this from the Jewish custom of giving the cup of life. So when we give, it's back to the apostles. But no, really, I find it so annoying. Instead of going back to the original, no one else has this. No one else has this. Or the Stephana. It's not only one of joy. Why is it just a wreath? Later, in certain parts, like Russia, they would make crowns. No. The original word wreath. Where did we get it from? From the ancient Greek custom, the Olympian Games. The victors, the couple become victors. And they're given a plain wreath. Of course, nowadays, wreaths become very expensive and very ornate and all that. Kala. But the origins are from victory in its simplest form. See, we go way back. And when we come up, the couple still kisses the hand of the father, because the daughter kisses her father's hand. She no longer is Kumatos, she becomes Vasiliou Parakala. I'm using my granddaughter's example. She says, goodbye. I ask for your blessing, Baba. I'm becoming the wife. And in our church, there are no vows. No vows. That's a commercialized form in the West. In our church, it's two souls, one soul they become, μια ψυχή, in two bodies, so that the couple are one soul. The wedding joins, I am joined with one soul, with my wife, living in my body and her body, but it's one soul. That's the sacrament. It's not a ceremony. And I see these, they go out, ceremony. Did that be ceremony, right? Did that be sacrament? Getting away from our roots.
Father Katerlis, we'd like to thank you for speaking with us this afternoon and wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.
For more information about sponsoring or viewing the interview series, visit the Greek American Heritage Society of Philadelphia online at gahsp.org.